All right, thank you so much, Kelly, and good afternoon, everyone. Again, as Kelly just mentioned, my name is Danna Casserly, and I'm a supervising attorney at the Pennsylvania Health Law Project, and I'm joined by my colleague, Marissa Lawal. And today we're going to be talking about Medicaid for kids. And our goal today really is to provide advocates with a basic overview of the Medicaid program. So to start, what is the Medicaid program and why is it so important for kids? Then we'll get into a discussion of the medical assistance or Medicaid eligibility rules that apply to kids. We'll talk about how to apply for Medicaid. And at the end, we'll have a short discussion about what to do if you meet with a client who's been denied coverage or services by their medical assistance or Medicaid insurer. So let's jump right into part one, which is an overview of Medicaid and EPSDT. Pennsylvania's Medicaid program, as I mentioned, is also known as medical assistance, or MA. So you'll hear me use those terms interchangeably. I try to stick to using Medicaid. Sometimes I do say medical assistance. It's the same program. It's administered by our Department of Human Services here in Pennsylvania, which is formerly called the Department of Public Welfare, or DPW. And the medical assistance or Medicaid program is run in partnership with the Federal Medicaid Agency, CMS. Medicaid is a free, publicly funded health insurance program for kids from low-income families and kids with disabilities. And it also covers other people, of course, besides just kids. So adults can be on Medicaid too, but today our focus is going to be on kids. Now, Medicaid charges no copays for children, and there's no monthly premium for the coverage either. So the coverage is entirely free for kids. Adults on Medicaid do pay small copays, and sometimes they pay a monthly premium, but this should never be the case for kids. Medicaid has the broadest and best coverage of medical and mental and behavioral health services for people under the age of 21, really of any insurance plan. It provides a very broad benefit package, so that meaning the services that are covered. And that's because of EPSDT, which is the children's health component of federal Medicaid law. So what is EPSDT? In public benefits, we really love our acronyms, and this is a big one. So EPSDT stands for the Early and Periodic Screening, Diagnostic, and Treatment Program. And again, it's the children's health component of our federal Medicaid law. EPSDT creates a mandatory set of requirements and services for all Medicaid recipients under the age of 21. So to break this down a little bit, early and periodic screening, diagnostic, and treatment, that's sort of a mouthful. So let's go through each part of the EPSDT program. First, the early component of EPSDT means assessing and identifying problems early on. Periodic means checking a child's health at periodic age-appropriate intervals. Screening means providing physical, mental, developmental, hearing, vision, dental, and other screening tests to the child to detect potential problems or conditions that the child might have. Diagnosis means covering diagnostic tests to follow up when a risk is identified through a screening. And finally, treatment means controlling, correcting, or reducing health problems that are found. And treatment is really where we see the bulk of the services that our kids are getting under Medicaid. According to the Georgetown Center for Children and Families, a child with untreated health problems is more likely to experience cognitive, behavioral, or physical disabilities during childhood and to later develop conditions like high blood pressure, heart disease, and diabetes. Around 25% of children who are under the age of 6 are at a moderate to high risk for developmental, behavioral, or social delay. Preventative care, especially for those young children who are from low-income families, can preempt more complicated and costly treatments and conditions later in life. Early childhood screening can uncover developmental concerns and help kids effectively obtain the health or education services that they need to reach developmental milestones and prevent further delays. Now, additionally, as noted here on the slide, children who come from low-income families are more likely to experience things like vision, hearing, and speech problems. have untreated tooth decay, have high lead blood levels, behavioral health issues, anemia, and asthma. And the list goes on. There are more conditions there as well. So in recognition of these determining factors, EPSDT essentially requires screening, detection, and attention to health problems through proper treatment for kids on Medicaid in order to help alleviate and avoid those kinds of problems, both in childhood and later in life as adults. So what does all this mean for us as lawyers and as advocates? Well, under EPSDT, state Medicaid programs must cover all services and treatments that are medically necessary to correct or ameliorate a child's condition. So when we're talking about this, we're really in that treatment component of EPSDT. Now, when we say that a service is medically necessary to correct or ameliorate, what that means is anything that will either improve or maintain the child's health in the best condition possible, to compensate for a health problem, or prevent it from worsening, or prevent the development of additional health problems if the underlying condition goes untreated. And this is really a recognition of the ongoing health needs of children with complex and chronic disabilities, and the need to prevent especially those low-income children from having health conditions undetected, which worsen during childhood and can lead to problems later in life. Now, importantly, EPSDT also requires coverage of medically necessary services for kids, whether or not those services are covered under the state plan for adults. So that means things that are not covered for adults, like braces, eyeglasses, intensive behavioral health services, shift nursing, all can be covered for kids because of our EPSDT program. And medically necessary services also need to be provided in a sufficient amount, duration, and scope to reasonably achieve their purpose. So what that means is to correct or ameliorate conditions that are identified through that screening process that we mentioned. So I've used that term medically necessary a few times now. When the Medicaid insurance company says that a service is denied, it's generally going to be because they claim that the service is not medically necessary. So the doctor requests a service for your client, the insurance company reviews that request and decides that they don't feel it meets the definition of medical necessity under our state regulations. So let's go through what that means. There's no definition of medical necessity in federal law, but Pennsylvania's definition is here on the slide, and it's actually quite a good definition as compared to some other states, because for one thing, it's very broad. You just need to meet one of these three prongs. So will the service prevent the onset of an illness, condition, or disability? Will the service or item or piece of equipment, whatever it is we're talking about, reduce or ameliorate the physical, mental, or developmental effects of the child's condition or disability? Or will it help the child to achieve or maintain maximum functional capacity in performing their daily activities? And that latter prong takes into account both the functional capacity of the child and those functional capacities that are appropriate for children of the same age. Essentially, when we're talking about services for kids and proving medical necessity, if you can show that the service in question meets one of the three prongs here, you win. The child should get that service. So that's really the basis of all the appeals that we fight with the insurance company. So here's an example. Feeding therapy is medically necessary for a child because it meets the prong on the screen, number 3. It's going to help the child achieve functional capacity in performing the daily activity of eating. It's also very likely going to meet prong 1 and prong 2 because that feeding therapy is going to help the child avoid worsening conditions. So for example, they don't eat or they aspirate when they eat, and it will reduce or ameliorate a feeding problem detected through a screening. So for example, failure to thrive or some other physical issue like GERD or reflux. Now, I mentioned that services for kids on Medicaid are very broad and can be covered for kids even if they aren't covered for adults. Here on the slide, I've listed some of the services that are commonly covered by Medicaid for kids. which make it such an attractive, robust, and beneficial program for our kids. And a lot of these services, the more involved services, again, are not covered by typical commercial insurance companies. All of this is possible because of EPSDT. So the reason I just spent time going through those legal underpinnings is because we want to answer this why question before we get into the how. So the eligibility rules and how to apply and actually get medical assistance for a child, we're going to get to that. But knowing about EPSDT and medical necessity allows us to understand how vitally important the Medicaid program is as a safety net for all children, whether we're talking about a child with a disability or a typically developing healthy child, or whether we're talking about a child from a moderate income family or middle income family, or a child from a low income family. Because of EPSDT, I mentioned, medical assistance or Medicaid offers the best insurance package that a child can have generally, because it covers services that are generally not covered by private insurance, and it covers those services without any caps, lifetime limits, or co-pays. So I talked about no co-pays or cost sharing already, but also note that there can't be any caps on services. So a Medicaid insurance company cannot say, we'll only cover 20 physical therapy visits per year for a child. They might be able to say that for an adult, but because of EPSDT, there cannot be any caps like that. Medicaid can be a child's only insurance, or it can be secondary to other coverage. Now, many families find that Medicaid is useful to supplement or cover those services or equipments that are not covered by a child's primary insurance, so such as insurance through a parent's employer. Again, that's because primary or private insurance is not subject to EPSDT requirements like Medicaid is. And later we'll talk about another important legal underpinning of the Medicaid program, which is the strong due process protections that apply to Medicaid coverage and services. And that's just one more factor supporting the why. So in other words, the importance of Medicaid for our clients, especially our clients that are kids. So we've gone through the importance of EPSDT and Medicaid for kids. But before we move on to eligibility and who qualifies, I just want to pause and highlight a few areas that we as advocates can be aware of for our clients with regard to EPSDT advocacy. So first and foremost, you're going to hear from Marissa in a little bit about how children in Pennsylvania are enrolled in managed care companies. What you should understand is that Medicaid managed care and EPSDT may very well be at odds. So in other words, the concept of ensuring all medically necessary services can be in conflict with that very concept of managed care, which typically seeks to limit certain more expensive services, things like physical therapy and shift nursing. And that's all because these managed care insurance companies are concerned about their bottom line. Whether they say that or not, they are companies that are concerned about the bottom line. And because all kids in Pennsylvania are required to be enrolled in managed care, it's imperative that we as advocates work to ensure that the full scope of EPSDT benefits are provided to kids as the law intends, and that service decisions are not made based on that bottom line or some other inappropriate reason. Or that when those service denials are made, we fight those decisions by filing an appeal. And the managed care plans are not the only targets for EPSDT advocacy. Providers and prescribers, so like doctors, may not be aware of EPSDT's scope. Sometimes we need to educate providers about the breadth of EPSDT. For example, in response to a managed care company denying a prescribed service like speech therapy, perhaps that doctor is just going to take that denial at face value and assume that there's nothing that can be done. But if that doctor knows about EPSDT, they might be much more inclined to help their patient fight that denial with their insurance company because they understand the strong entitlement that their patient has to that service. And similarly, families or our clients are not always aware of the full scope of EPSDT. So you might speak with a family who has a denial for speech therapy for their child, and they just assume, just like that doctor, that It is what it is. There may not be anything they can do. But don't let them take no for an answer. Help them fight that denial by showing that the service is, in fact, medically necessary through the appeal process, which we're going to talk about later on. I'm just going to pause and ask my colleague Marissa if there's any questions before I move on to the eligibility section.
Hi, Danna. There are no questions right now.
Okay. All right, so we're going to move on to the how. In other words, who qualifies for Medicaid and how do you get your client into this wonderful program that I just talked about for a little while? How do you get them into that program in the first place? So there are 3 basic threshold questions for any Medicaid eligibility review. The first is category, the second is state residency, and the third is citizenship or immigration status. So first, for the category piece, the child has to fit into a particular category of Medicaid eligibility in order to get coverage. This means either that they're low income or that they have a disability. These are the 2 broad umbrellas of Medicaid categories for kids in Pennsylvania. We'll go through these categories today over the next handful of slides. Once you determine the category that the child should fit into, then you need to figure out, does the child's household income meet the applicable limit for that category? Now, importantly, there are times when a parent's income does not count for their child's eligibility, and we're going to get into that category in a moment. But generally, household income does count and needs to be below the applicable limit for that child's household size and that child's age. Very importantly, there is no resource or asset limit for children. So that's the case for any category of Medicaid, unlike the rules for adults where you have to meet, in addition to the income limits, you have to meet a resource limit as well. Children have no resource limits for Medicaid. The second prong of the analysis is Pennsylvania residency. And we're going to get into these in more detail in a moment. I'm just kind of giving a broad overview at first. Children applying for Medicaid have to be a resident of our state. So residency is generally pretty straightforward. You just have to be physically present in Pennsylvania and intend to stay here. There's no minimum period of time required to establish residency, and you don't need to have a fixed or permanent address to apply for Medicaid. You just need somewhere to get your mail, because we're going to talk about how to apply and the things that are going to be important regarding the application and coverage are all going to come through the mail. So if you have a client who doesn't have a permanent address, they can actually use the address of a friend or a family member or a social service agency. So that has nothing to do with whether they're considered a Pennsylvania resident or not. And lastly, the child has to either be a US citizen or they have to have the appropriate immigration status in order to qualify for Medicaid. So I'm going to pause and talk about immigration for children, just broad strokes, because that could be a whole training on its own. And actually, Mary Pat from CLS did a really wonderful training this past Friday on immigrant access to public benefits. So I'm going to go over a few important pieces of it, but for the sake of time, we can't dive into that too much today because it's just a big subject. So in Pennsylvania, children under 21 only need to be lawfully present in order to get Medicaid. They don't need to meet the stricter qualified immigrant status that's required for adults. And there's no 5-year bar or waiting period like there is for some adults. So here on this slide, I've linked to where you can find the lawful presence definition. Essentially, the term includes almost anyone who's in the United States with permission, even if they're here just for a short or finite period of time. So some examples of people that are considered lawfully present are people who have U visas, tourist or student visas, people with temporary protected status, kids who are asylees, or kids with pending applications for special immigrant juvenile status, kids with pending applications for adjustment of status, and there are other ones listed there too. Now, one quick note about DACA. People with deferred action are lawfully in the United States, but the Obama administration made it so that people who are in deferred action status under the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals or DACA program are not considered lawfully present for the purposes of federal health benefits eligibility. So this includes federally funded Medicaid and CHIP, which we'll talk about in a moment. Now, I will note that there is a limited state-funded Medicaid program which DACA kids could conceivably qualify for if their income's very low and they meet the categorical requirement, basically if they have a disability. But for the interest of time today, our focus is going to be on federally funded Medicaid and CHIP, and I'm more than happy to talk offline if you happen to have a child who is a DACA recipient or has any other immigration status and you're not sure if that makes them eligible for Medicaid or not. Now, one last note about immigrant children before we move on to the categories. EMA, or Emergency Medical Assistance, is basically going to be the only option for health insurance coverage for kids who are undocumented. They have to meet the two other requirements, so Pennsylvania residency, and they have to fit into a category. But having the emergency medical condition is going to be a way around the immigration status requirement. All right, so let's talk about categories of Medicaid eligibility. So how do you get in through that door? The first one is SSI, which is not really a category so much as something that I want everybody to note, is that a child receiving supplemental security income, or SSI, automatically qualifies for Medicaid in Pennsylvania. There's no separate application needed, and the child will just get that monthly cash benefit and get the Medicaid insurance card automatically. The child just has to meet the Social Security Child Disability criteria, which I've linked to here on the slide. Plus, they have to meet the SSI income and resource limits. So they have to be from a family with low enough income to make them financially eligible for SSI, plus the child has to be disabled, according to Social Security rules. So that's SSI Medicaid. That's pretty straightforward. Let's get into the next category, which is the major one, and it's called MAGI, or Modified Adjusted Gross Income. Now, this category of Medicaid uses tax law to determine household size and income for the purpose of qualifying. Remember that I said you need to meet the income limits for the category that you fit into. Now, as with nearly all public benefits, the household income limit is going to change based on a person's household size. So to determine the MAGI household size, the basic rule is that the household for MAGI includes all individuals who are claimed as exemptions on the tax return. Now, in the next few slides, I'm going to go through some examples of the rules that will illustrate how to figure out someone's household size for MAGI. In terms of MAGI income, for our purpose today, just understand that MAGI means taxable income plus 3 types of income that are normally not taxed but are included in MAGI for eligibility purposes. And that includes Social Security benefits, tax-exempt interest, and excluded foreign income. So non-taxable interest and excluded foreign income are generally not common for our client base, but it's certainly possible. But of course, Social Security benefits are more common, what we'll see. To determine whether a type of income is taxable, you can consult IRS guidance. Specifically, an important publication that I've linked to here on the slide is IRS Publication 525. And I've also linked to the Medical Assistance Eligibility Handbook, which goes through the types of income that count for MAGI. Some common types of income that are not counted for MAGI, which I'll just mention briefly, are child support, workers' compensation, TANF, and SSI. So the general takeaway there for income is really that you should assume something is taxable unless it's specifically exempt from the MAGI counting rules. Now, a special note here about infants under the age of 1. If a baby is born to a mother who's on medical assistance at the time of delivery, that baby is automatically eligible under MAGI from birth through age 1. so long as the baby continues to live with the mother, and that's regardless of any changes in income during the year. So that's huge. That's a really important thing to note. At age 1, the child is going to be re-reviewed for ongoing Medicaid eligibility in other categories, but they get that coverage for up to that first year at least. So here's a slide that shows the MAGI income limits based on a child's age and household size. So you're going to look at this based on the income that your client has and their household size, which I'm going to get into in a moment, and see if their income is below the limit for their age and household size. And you'll note that younger children have a higher income limit generally than older children. So as a child gets older, they have to meet a stricter income limit to qualify for MAGI. So who is in the MAGI household? Oh, excuse me. The way you determine MAGI household size differs based on whether someone's considered a tax filer, a tax dependent, or a non-filer. So this is, sounds complex, but if you just start out by asking your client whether they file taxes or does somebody claim them as a dependent on their taxes, that's going to put you well on your way to figuring out if they are going to be MAGI eligible or not. So if your client says that they're a tax filer, their household for MAGI purposes is going to be themselves, their spouse, and anyone they claim as a dependent. If your client is a tax dependent, their household is going to be the same as the household of the tax filer who claims them. Now, as with everything, there are exceptions to these rules. So there are 3 situations when you would apply the non-filer rules, even though someone is a tax dependent. So that's important for kids. The first is when the tax dependent is not a child of the taxpayer. In that case, you want to apply the non-filer rules to determine the tax dependent's household size. I'm going to go over the non-filer rules on the next slide. The second exception is where a child under the age of 19 lives with both parents who are not expected to file a joint tax return. In that case, you also use the non-filer rules. And lastly, use the non-filer rules when a child under 19 is claimed as a tax dependent by a non-custodial parent. Okay, so here on the slide, I've put those non-filer rules that I just talked about. Remember that someone could just be a non-filer as well because they just don't need to file a tax return under IRS rules. So maybe it's because their income is too low to meet that threshold of needing to file. They would be looked at under the non-filer rules as well. But this set of rules also captures those kids I just talked about who, although they're tax dependents of someone else, their MAGI household is determined using these non-filer rules. So if the non-tax filer that you're helping is age 19 or older, their household for MAGI purposes includes that individual plus their spouse if they're living together, and any children under the age of 19 if the child is living in the household as well. Now, if the non-filer that you're helping is under the age of 19, their household is going to be themselves plus the following people if they're living together: biological, adoptive, or step parents, siblings under the age of 19, including biological, adoptive, half, or step siblings, spouse, and biological, adoptive, or step children of the non-filer. So if you're a visual learner like I am, I included this chart for you. It's from Health Reform Beyond the Basics. You might like this chart as much as I do, and it goes through how to determine who's in the MAGI household using a set of yes or no questions. So basically you get to figure out whether to apply the tax filer rules, the tax dependent rules, or the non-filer rules. Now let's go through some examples because I think that's the best way to do this. So here's an example that illustrates the MAGI household when we have 2 non-married parents living together. So Dan and Jen live together with their 2 children, Ethan and Olivia, ages 4 and 6. Dan and Jen file separate tax returns because they're not married, and Jen claims Ethan and Olivia as tax dependents. Dan files as a single adult and he doesn't claim any dependents. To determine the household size for Dan and Jen, Medicaid is going to use the tax filer rules. But to determine the household size for the kids, Ethan and Olivia, Medicaid would apply the non-filer rules because they're children living with both parents who are not expected to file a joint tax return. So here's a table that illustrates that Magi household analysis for this family. You'll see that Dan is a household of 1 because he's a single tax filer with no dependents. Jen is a tax filer who claims the 2 children as dependents, so her household is 3 for Magi purposes. And Ethan and Olivia are each going to be a household of 4 for Magi purposes because their household under the non-filer rules includes themselves, their mother who claims them, their father, Dan, and their sibling. So that illustrates that exception. Now here's one last example that illustrates Magi household. And this speaks to that rule I mentioned, or the exception I mentioned, where if a child is claimed by a tax dependent who is not their parent, then the non-filer rules apply. So here's how that plays out for this example. Lena lives with her grandmother and she's under her guardianship and she's 5 years old. Lena doesn't have any siblings or parents living with her. Her grandmother claims her as a dependent on her tax return. So Lena is a tax dependent, but she falls under one of those exceptions because she's not the dependent of her parents. This means that Medicaid is going to use the non-filer rules to determine her household. And as a result, Lena's household only consists of herself. So she's a household of 1 for Magi purposes. So the main takeaway here really is that the Magi household analysis is not just as simple as who lives with you. It's more nuanced and it can be complex, but by following these handouts and knowing to ask about tax filing status, you should be able to determine someone's household size, and then anyone who has countable income in the household is going to be included in that eligibility analysis. So it'll give you that household size. Anyone included in the household, you count their income and see if it's under the limit that we put on the slide a few moments ago. Now, before we move away from Magi, I just want to mention one other subset category of Magi that's very important. Under the Affordable Care Act, individuals who are in foster care and enrolled in Medicaid at any time on or after their 18th birthday qualify for Medicaid under the former foster youth category. The most important takeaway here is that this category, unlike other categories, has no income or resource limit. You just have to be under the age of 26, have received Medicaid in federal or state funded foster care on or after the 18th birthday, and meet the US citizenship or immigration status requirements that we talked about. So health insurance coverage is especially important for this population of youth because they tend to have higher healthcare needs than their peers, and they also don't have that opportunity to stay on their parents' health insurance through age 26 like some of their peers do. So this is a wonderful category for those kids. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and switch over to my colleague Marissa for the next half of our presentation, but I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions first.
There are no questions at this time.
Okay. All right, go ahead. You can share your screen, Marissa.
Marissa, while you're getting your screen ready, this is Kelly, and I am going to be launching the first of the 2 CLE poll boxes. Please respond to the question on the screen and submit it, and you will have 1.5 minutes to do so. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. Hi, everyone. As Danna said, I'm staff attorney at the Pennsylvania Health Law Project. And at this point, we're going to switch gears and talk about eligibility for kids with disabilities when their parents' income make them ineligible for Medicaid. We're also going to discuss CHIP, how to apply, and the appeals process. Under PH 95, that captures children with disabilities who are ineligible for SSI because their parents' income or assets are too high for them to qualify, and also ineligible for Medicaid in the Magi category. Under PH95, the category of Medicaid, parental income and resources do not count for eligibility. And this is huge. Think of a middle-class family of 4 making $45,000 per year, and they have a 4-year-old with, cerebral palsy or another complex medical condition. That child would normally be ineligible for Medicaid due to household income, yet we know caring for a child with needs such as cerebral palsy would not be sustainable on an annual income of $45,000 a year. And there's a serious struggle between insurance premiums, copays, and services not covered at all by private insurance plans. The result would be devastating for that child and the family. So this comes, as a fantastic program through Pennsylvania called PH95, and it's allowed kids with disabilities to get the robust MA coverage that Danna talked about without regards to their parents' income. However, please note that parental income still needs to be reported to the county assistance office when applying. On this slide, I've included a link to the fact sheet reporting parental income for PH95. I can't tell you how many calls we get where their families don't want to provide it or don't realize they have to, and it delays the process of their child getting insurance. So that's really important to remember. Some income of the child does count, and the child's own income needs to be below $1,041 per month. This is in 2019. There are 2 main kinds of income that would count against a child in this context, and that's interest or dividends on bank accounts, stock, bonds, CDs, or other investments, which are in the child's name and reported to the IRS under the child's social security number. The principal is not counted though. It's considered an exempt resource. And then the other kind of income of a child that counts for PH95 is earnings from the child's job. The child is working, a portion of those earnings are counted, essentially half of it. And however, a child earns enough to be over the income limit would probably not qualify for medical assistance under this category anyway, on account of meeting the disability guidelines. To qualify for PH95, the child's disability or medical condition must meet the Social Security disability criteria for children known as childhood listing of impairments. It doesn't mean the child needs to be on SSI, but it does mirror that criteria. We often get questions about whether a child's condition will meet the standard. In those cases, we always suggest that just apply and find out. Don't try to be a doctor and determine on the front end whether a child meets the standards. Have them apply and you can sort through the results after that. And doing that, you want to spend time thinking about documentation. Gather as much information as you possibly can to show the child meets the criteria. This can be an IEP, letters from doctors or psychiatrists, reports from anyone who has evaluated the child, education records, and anything similar. Essentially, the more documentation you can provide to show the impairments the child has, the better. In general, the disability standards consider the extent to which the child's disability or conditions limit the child's ability to perform basic functions appropriate for his or her age group. These basic functions include physical and neurological functioning, such as the ability to walk, talk, or feed themselves, sensory functioning, so ability to see or hear, cognitive and psychological functioning, including the ability to maintain relationships with others and avoid violent behavior in dangerous situations. To learn more about PH95, our office does have a PH95 guide, which is linked on this slide and can be found on our website. You can also look at the MA eligibility handbook. It's chapter 315. If you have a client who's over the income limit for MAGI and the child is has no disabilities and would not qualify for PH95, the other option is CHIP, which is the Children's Health Insurance Program, and it provides free or low-cost insurance for children under age 19 who do not have any other health insurance and do not qualify for Medicaid. So unlike Medicaid, a child cannot have other insurance and still qualify for CHIP. However, if a child is currently covered by a parent's insurance through work, for instance, but the parent is losing the health benefit soon, they can apply for CHIP prior to the loss of coverage and should note the end date of the existing coverage on the application. Applying ahead of time will prevent any lapse in coverage. The CHIP, income, and household rules follow the MAGI rules we just discussed. There's a link on the slide to the chart that shows annual income limits based on the child's age and household size, as well as the schedule of average copays and premiums for low cost or full cost CHIP. Free CHIP has no monthly premiums or copays. So for example, a free CHIP, a 10-year-old child from a household of 3 can get free CHIP if their annual household income is below $44,000 per year, assuming the household income is above the MAGI limit for the same group and household size, so around $29,000 per year, since CHIP is only for children who are non-Medicaid eligible. Because the CHIP income limits vary by age, you might have a family with some kids on MA and some kids on CHIP. If a child is clearly over the income limits for Medicaid and not eligible for PH95, then they should apply for CHIP. If it's less clear whether a child is Medicaid eligible, and maybe you're not exactly sure of the household income, or not sure if they would be PH95 eligible, we always advise to apply for Medicaid first. If they are found ineligible for Medicaid, their application should be booted to CHIP automatically for review. Conversely, if they apply for CHIP and they appear to be Medicaid eligible, CHIP will send them back to the medical assistance office, though there's no wrong way to do it. As long as you're working to get children covered for insurance, that's the goal. But lastly, I just wanted to note there's no EPSDT in the CHIP program. A child with complex health needs may not be well served in CHIP, so you would want to consider PH95. And there is a CHIP to PH95 referral process, which can be found in the Medicaid eligibility handbook. So that was a lot of information on different kinds of insurance. Now we're going to talk about how to apply. Danna, are there any questions before we move forward?
Nope, we don't have any questions yet. People are being quiet today.
Okay, either quiet or we put them to sleep. All right, so how to apply for Medicaid. You can do this online, by phone, or mail or in person. Because of time, I'm sort of gonna fly through this, but feel free to put in any questions if you have them. Those are the general 3 ways to apply. When someone applies using a paper application form, just note that they should mail it certified mail to the county assistance office. Pre-COVID times, we would suggest you drop it off in person, get a time-stamped receipt, but we understand that is just not always a possibility right now. So if you're going to send in the paper application, be sure to mail it certified and keep a copy so that way there's no, they can't say they didn't receive it. Here on the slide, I've linked to a copy of the PA600CH, which is intended for use by children and pregnant women, but note that any application is a good application, meaning the county assistance office should accept any of the forms, no matter the category of eligibility or populations. Families can apply using the regular PA600 application for benefits, which also includes other benefits like SNAP, LIHEAP, or they can use the PA600HC, which is the app just for health coverage, and is shorter. So the link on the slide addresses all of the county assistance office. Most counties have one office. Some of the larger counties like Philadelphia and Allegheny County have several district offices. We often encourage people to apply online, via Compass, and that's how you can apply for many other programs such as SNAP and LIHEAP. And then this is secure and gives a confirmation. However, the Compass app is longer than paper applications, especially the 600CH that we use for kids and pregnant women. Also, at the end of the Compass application, it will give you a list of what is needed. And in some counties, you can upload info directly to Compass. Otherwise, you would need to mail and drop off follow-up paperwork. But it'll give you the address of the county assistance office where things need to be submitted to. Application forms. Here's a list of the forms. They do come in other languages. You can take a look at that. For the application process, paper verifications required for most eligibility factors listed on the application. DHS engages in some data sharing with other government agencies, such as Social Security for SSI or Social Security income. But in general, however, applicants must submit paper verification unless told otherwise. It can take up to 30 days for a decision once the application is submitted, but this can be expedited in case of medical emergency, and it's usually enough just to have a doctor letter or other medical records showing need for the care is immediate. And you can make an argument that waiting 30 days would be harmful to the applicant's health because of medications needed right now, or surgery or something of the like. Contact your county assistance office ombudsman or supervisor to make this ask. That normally speeds up the process. And keep in mind, Medicaid does allow retroactive coverage for up to 3 months prior to the date of application. If you can show that they were eligible during that time period, it's helpful to show unpaid medical bills that have accrued when uninsured. And if Medicaid is approved, it is backdated and they can bill for that service as if they had insurance at that time. All applicants are entitled to notice of this decision and a right to appeal if their application is denied, which we will get to later on in this presentation.
Marissa, I'm sorry to interrupt. There's some kind of buzzing noise that we're hearing in your audio.
Yeah, I think it's coming from my laptop. And I don't know how to fix it because I heard it come up too. Am I loud enough that you can hear me over it?
You can hear you over it. It's just having the noise in the background. I just wanted to make you aware of it.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's kind of coming and going, so.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but it's coming from my laptop itself.
Okay, I just wanted to make you aware of it and see if there's anything we could do to fix it.
No, I'm sorry.
Thanks.
No. So individuals approved for Medicaid will get an approval notice and welcome packet, which will include the access card. Individuals who only have Medicaid get the yellow access card, and individuals who also have food stamps or cash assistance have a greenish blue access card. During this newly eligible period, the access card will act as their temporary Medicaid insurance card for a few weeks until the individual selects and enrolls into a managed care or MCO. PA's managed care system is known as Health Choices, and it operates 5 zones in the state. Depending on which Health Choices zone your client lives in, they'll have a choice of a handful of managed cares to choose from that are operating there. The MCO acts like an HMO, and it manages benefits, coordinates care. Individuals have to get care from doctors in that plan's network, pick a PCP in that network, etc. Once the person enrolls into an MCO, they'll get a new MCO card in the mail, like the Keystone First card that's listed on the slide, which will replace their access card for MA benefits. If you don't choose an MCO, the state will randomly assign the child to a plan. If they have certain doctors they want to see or hospitals they use, they may not be a network of the plan they're enrolled to. So you want to keep that in mind. And you can change plans at any time. It's usually effective the first of the following month. If you make a choice by the 15th, you can go online, call, or enroll using a paper form. Or you can go to www.enrollnow.net to compare plans, enroll, or change plans. Just a note regarding HIP, in Pennsylvania, almost everyone's required to enroll in a managed care to receive benefits. The main exception for our purposes is kids in HIP. They stay in fee-for-service, so they keep the access card as their insurance coverage. And HIP stands for Health Insurance Premium Payment Program. It's run by DHS and is essentially a cost containment program aimed at saving the state money by purchasing employer-based insurance available to a child. If it's more effective than putting the kid into an MCO and paying the MCO a capitation rate. HIP is really too into the weeds for today's discussion, but bottom line, if you have a family and they have an access card, then that's most likely the reason why. This is just a map of the way that Health Choices is broken up across the state. So next is part 4, so it's appeal rights. I'm not sure if we have any questions now. I sort of blew through that.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. I wanted to note, Marissa, that the access card that was on that slide is the new redesigned card for 2020. I put this in the chat box as well. So they're no longer going to issue those yellow or even the older greenish yellow card, greenish blue cards. So anyone who's newly eligible is going to get that new card, or if someone loses their card and needs a replacement, they're going to get that new one.
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
But there's no other questions.
Okay. So for appeal rights, have we mentioned throughout this presentation, there's very strong legal protections available to Medicaid recipients, and that includes the discussion of EPSDT and other essential parts of this in the due process rights set forth in the beginning with the 1970 Supreme Court case of Goldberg v. Kelly. These rights are incorporated to clearly apply to Medicaid benefits by a series of court decisions since Goldberg. So in Goldberg, the court held that recipients of certain public benefits are entitled to procedural due process at any time their benefits are at risk. In practice, there's really a twofold due process analysis stemming from this case and the subsequent case law and policy. Individuals are entitled to adequate notice of a decision regarding their benefits, and they must be given a reasonable opportunity to be heard, so have a hearing. Note that these procedural due process protections apply in both the eligibility context, so applications for Medicaid and service decisions, including denials of service once a person is already on Medicaid. So we'll talk a little bit about each of these two main takeaways. So first is notice. The notice they receive must be adequate, so it has to contain certain information. It must state the basis for the action and when coverage is to be reduced or terminated. It must be sent in advance of the decision taking effect, and informing the individuals of the right to continued benefits pending the appeal outcome. On this, I just want to pause to make an important note that many clients are unaware of the right to continued benefits pending appeal. The notices are historically not well written and give confusing information about the deadline to apply. There is a longer appeal deadline if continued benefits are not being sought, namely 30 days for eligibility denials and up to 120 for service denials. But if a client wants to keep current benefits or services active while their appeal is pending, they must act much more quickly. They have to act within 10 days from the date on notice for service denials, or within 15 days from the date on notice for eligibility denials. Notices are mailed the following business day, so clients with adverse decisions made Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, they would get 14 days to appeal from the date of the mailing, and clients with adverse appeals made on a Friday get 12 days to appeal. There's no, account of business days. So the 15-day window rule lives in the eligibility handbook at sections 377.1 and 377.3. This is just a sample eligibility notice that the client would receive, and then the right to appeal into a fair hearing request form should be included in with their denial notice. If they have a service denial, that would look like this form here. It should tell them what service was requested, why they're denying it, which is normally for the medical necessity definition. And then if they're in a health choices program, it should contain a complaint or grievance request form. If for some reason they utilize an access card or in fee for service, they would receive a fair hearing request form at that point. Notice and appeals. So the second piece is the opportunity to be heard. So the hearing must give the individual a meaningful opportunity to be heard. So they must be allowed to confront and cross-examine the witnesses and provide evidence relied on by the state agency in making the decision. And the hearing must take place before a neutral or impartial decision maker. The forum for the hearing depending on the type of MA coverage someone has, which I alluded to before. For individuals denied Medicaid eligibility and they're appealing a denied application, their appeal avenue is a hearing before an administrative law judge from the Department of Human Services. If an individual is in fee-for-service and has an access card and they're denied Medicaid services, that hearing, they'll go right to a hearing with an administrative law judge from DHS. And for individuals in an MCO who are denied services, they have an additional appeal avenue available to them. First, they have to file for a grievance, which is an informal review internally with their MCO to dispute a coverage decision. And once they exhaust the grievance, they can proceed to a fair hearing before an ALJ. Exhaustion required as of 2018. They managed care federal regulations changed. So there used to be 2 internal grievances. Now there's only 1. And then they changed some timeframes for filing the appeal and deadlines for a decision. I don't want to get into too much substance here because we are running short on time. But if you have any issues, you can feel free to call PHLP about this issue. But for now, just remember, always appeal and do it early. Remember due process and EPSDT, so don't take no for an answer. EPSDT and broad medical necessity definition. If a doctor prescribes it, appeal it. County assistance offices and MCOs, they can get it wrong. They're not the end all be all. And it may be that not enough documentation was provided or paperwork was lost or they reviewed for the wrong category. Usually through the appeal is when we can uncover some kind of misstep like this, and it can be addressed either before the hearing or at the hearing. Important case law, known as the juris rule, also codified in 55 PA Code 275.5, says that you can submit new information to establish eligibility or medical necessity at the hearing, even if it was not submitted with the application or service request. And finally, from a practical standpoint, most eligibility denials can be resolved prior to the hearing. So still advise the client to request a fair hearing if their Medicaid application is denied, but then working on making contact with the supervisor in the county assistance office to settle and find out why exactly they were denied. So how to appeal? You can appeal an eligibility denial, complete the fair hearing request form, or write a letter and send to the county assistance office. For a service denial, you want to complete the grievance request form and send to the managed care. You can do this either via certified mail or fax. That should be provided to you on the notice that you receive, or you can call the member services line. And for more information on how to appeal, we do have a how to appeal service denials health choices on our website that you can find. So additional resources if you're interested, we have provided those for you. Other than that, thank you, and we've provided our phone numbers and direct emails, as well as our helpline, which is open Monday, Wednesday, Friday from 8 to 8, and you can give our helpline a call and leave a voicemail, and then we'll get back to you at that point. So I'm not sure if there are any questions. We've got 2 minutes to spare.
No, we have no questions. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Kelly.
That's okay. I was just going to say, if anyone has any questions or comments now, please type them in the chat box. And in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and launch the second of the CLE question box polls. So please respond to that as well as type in any questions or comments. I'd also like to thank Danna and Marissa for taking time out of their busy schedules to be with us today for this very important information. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having us,
Kelly.
Sure. And Danna, were you going to say something else?
Oh, I was just going to say there's no questions, and I really thank everyone for your time here. Of course, reach out to us if you have any questions. We're always happy to give some technical assistance, or you can refer clients to us as well.
Okay, well, we'll end a little early today. Thanks again for being with us, everyone. We hope that you enjoyed this session and have a good rest of the day.